July 1967. Somewhere behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union rolls out what looks like a brand new super fighter, and overnight, every radar room in the West lights up like a Christmas tree. Photos leak, reports flood in. Twin engines the size of truck tires. Massive air intakes. A wingspan built for power, not grace. They call it the MiG-25 Foxbat, and the numbers are terrifying. Rumor says it can hit Mach 3, launch air-to-air and long-range air-to-surface missiles, and climb so high it might touch the edge of space. Inside the Pentagon, the mood turns cold. One classified memo reads, "We currently have no fighter in our operational inventory that could successfully combat the Foxbat." Translation: if this thing is real, we're outgunned and out of luck. The Cold War had always been a chess match played in the shadows, but now it felt like the Soviets had just moved their queen across the board. For the first time, the United States wasn't leading the race for the skies. We were trying to catch up. But to understand how America found itself in this position, you've got to rewind a little, back to a different kind of war and a different kind of dogfight. During the Korean War, the F-86 Sabre and the Soviet-built MiG-15 went head-to-head over the Yalu River. It was the first true jet versus jet combat in history. Close, dirty, fast, the kind of fight where you could see the other guy's eyes through the canopy. Back then, victory came down to instincts, guts, and a little bit of luck. But by the mid-1950 seconds, everything changed. Technology took the stick away from the pilot and handed it to the engineer. Powerful new radars could spot an enemy long before a human eye ever could. And guided missiles promised the kind of kill that didn't need a turn fight, just a lock, a tone, and a push of a button. The age of the gunslinger pilot was fading fast. The future, they said, would belong to computers and missiles. And for a while, everyone believed it. By the late 50s, the Pentagon had convinced itself that the next big air war wouldn't be about maneuvers, it'd be about machines. They called it beyond visual range. The idea that future dogfights wouldn't even be fights at all. You'd see the enemy as nothing more than a tiny blip on a radar scope, launch a missile from miles away, and watch it vanish before you ever saw the pilot's face. And so came the F-4 Phantom, the crown jewel of that new doctrine. It wasn't built to dance. It was built to run fast and hit hard, a twin-engine rocket with radar the size of a dinner table and enough missiles to turn the sky into a minefield. To the brass, it was the future. They honestly thought the days of close-in dogfighting were over. But as history loves to remind us, the moment you think you've figured out war, it changes the rules on you. Then came Vietnam. What looked clean on paper turned messy in the real world. The skies over Southeast Asia were chaos, friendlies, enemies, and bombers, all jammed into the same airspace. Those fancy identification systems, they glitched, jammed, or flat out lied. So pilots had no choice but to do it the old school way. Close in, eyeball the target, and make damn sure before you fired. That's when everything fell apart. The big, heavy Phantoms suddenly found themselves dragged into knife fights with smaller, sharper MiGs, and the truth hit like a punch to the gut. Nobody had trained them for this. Their fancy new missiles, almost useless at short range. Designed to kill bombers at high altitude, they missed so often that early on, only about 14% ever hit anything. And when those missiles ran dry, Phantom pilots realized the unthinkable. They didn't even have a gun. Yeah, you heard that right. An American fighter with no gun. So when the missiles failed, all they could do was pray, run, or die, trying to outturn an enemy half their size. Those big, smoky engines might as well have been flares, advertising their position across half of North Vietnam. The smaller, lighter MiG-17 seconds and meager 21 seconds saw them coming miles away, lured them in. then pounced. The Phantom could hang in the fight, barely, but only because it was tough as nails. Still, it was like sending a linebacker into a boxing ring. It just wasn't built for that kind of fight, and American pilots paid the price. Losses climbed, morale sank, and the Air Force learned a hard truth: the expensive way. Dogfighting wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for a comeback, so the brass scrambled for band-aids. They slapped Gatling gun pods onto Phantoms and rushed pilots through crash courses on turning fights. But everybody knew that was just damage control. What the Air Force really needed was something built from the ground up to dominate the sky. A true air superiority fighter. Light on its feet, mean in a fight, and fast enough to kill before it got killed. That would mean tossing out every old idea about what a jet should be and starting from scratch. Because after Vietnam, one thing was clear: you can't win tomorrow's wars with yesterday's assumptions. And for the United States, the clock was already ticking. Then came 1967, and with it, another shock from the East. Out of nowhere, the Soviet Union unveiled a brand new fighter jet of their own. And this one didn't look anything like the stubby little MiGs American Phantoms were dogfighting over Vietnam. This thing looked mean, predatory even. Twin tails, wings wide enough to cast a shadow on a runway, engines the size of oil drums. Everything about it screamed one word: maneuverability. To the guys studying satellite photos at the Pentagon, it was a whole new beast. Words spread fast through the intelligence community. Maybe the Soviets had cracked the code on lightweight alloys. Maybe they'd built a radar system that could see farther than anything the West had ever fielded. Whatever it was, it sent chills down spines from Washington to NATO headquarters. And then, just a few months later, they made it official. The Soviets went on a record-breaking spree, posting world records for both speed and altitude that made Western analysts choke on their coffee. Mach 3, 80,000 feet. Numbers so wild they sounded like propaganda. Except they weren't. One Air Force report said it plain as day: we currently have no fighter in our operational inventory that could successfully combat the Foxbat. That's the kind of line that keeps generals awake at night. If Vietnam had already shaken American confidence, this poured jet fuel on the fire. The Soviets weren't just catching up, they were pulling ahead. They had the fastest jet on the planet, and the United States had nothing that could touch it. For nearly 2 decades, America had been building interceptors, fighter bombers, and attack jets. Aircraft built to hit hard, not necessarily to win a knife fight in the clouds. But now the writing was on the wall. If the US didn't act fast, it would lose the one advantage it had always counted on: air superiority. So in 1968, the Air Force threw down the gauntlet. They called in the nation's top aircraft designers: McDonnell Douglas, North American, Fairchild, and General Dynamics, and gave them a simple but brutal challenge: build a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outfight anything the Soviets could send into the sky. For the first time, design wasn't just about raw power, it was about energy. Pilots needed a jet that could trade altitude for speed, speed for position, and position for survival. And to measure that, engineers created something revolutionary: Energy-Maneuverability theory. It was mathematics turned into muscle. A formula that could tell you, with brutal honesty, whether your fighter could live or die in a turning battle. And from that moment on, America stopped reacting to the Soviet threat and started planning to erase it. It all started with math. Not the kind that lives in textbooks, the kind that decides whether you live or die at 30,000 feet. Engineers came up with a new formula, something called Energy-Maneuverability theory, a way to measure a fighter's true performance: how speed, thrust, drag, and weight all trade off in a turning battle. It wasn't poetry, but in the right hands, it was just as deadly. By December of 1969, the Pentagon made its call. The contract went to McDonnell Douglas, and their team got straight to work. 2.5 million man-hours later, The result was something the world had never seen. A fighter designed from the ground up for one purpose: absolute air dominance. They called it the F-15 Eagle. Two afterburning turbofan engines that could unleash a combined 48,000 pounds of thrust, enough muscle to break the sound barrier while flying straight up. Yeah, you heard that right. Straight up. Most jets claw their way through the sky. The Eagle punched through it. At full throttle, it could top Mach 2.5, making it the fastest fighter America had ever built. And yet, it could still turn tighter than anything its size had any right to. Earlier jets like the Phantom were trimmed for raw speed. Small wings, heavy frames, brutal acceleration. The F-15 flipped that philosophy on its head. It used a low-wing loading design, paired with a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1, meaning it could climb, roll, or bank without ever bleeding energy. In a knife fight, that's the difference between predator and prey. For the pilot, the view was pure power. The cockpit sat high on the fuselage beneath a bubble canopy that gave a full 360-degree command of the world outside. The new heads-up display projected flight data directly onto the glass, so the pilot never had to look down, a small detail that, in combat, meant the difference between staying alive and becoming a statistic. Underneath those wings sat 8 missiles, a mix of Sparrows and Sidewinders, ready to strike from beyond visual range. But if the fight got up close and personal, the Eagle still had teeth. A 20mm M61 Vulcan Gatling gun, capable of firing 6,000 rounds a minute. That's 100 shells a second, basically, a flying buzzsaw. Every inch of the F-15 said the same thing. This time, we're not playing catch-up. And for the first time in years, American pilots looked at a jet and thought, yeah, we can win with this. The F-15 wasn't just fast. It was built to survive. Engineers knew that speed means nothing if you can't make it home. So they gave it triple redundant hydraulics, low vulnerability flight controls, and a reinforced airframe tough enough to shrug off battle damage. It was the fighter equivalent of a heavyweight boxer with the reflexes of a sprinter. That mix of speed, power, and agility made the F-15 something the world had never seen. A jet designed not just to fly, but to dominate. And it didn't take long to prove it. In June of 1972, barely 3 years after McDonnell Douglas got the green light, the first prototype rolled out under a gray Missouri sky. And right from the start, you could tell this thing was different. When the testing began, the Air Force threw everything it had at the new jet. First up was the F-4 Phantom, big, tough, battle-proven. But against the Eagle, the Phantom looked like it was fighting underwater. The F-15 stayed cool, steady, in control, and took it apart without breaking a sweat. Then they pitted it against the F-5 Freedom Fighter, smaller, lighter, the stand-in for Soviet MiGs. Even that nimble little jet couldn't shake the Eagle off its tail. In nearly every mock dogfight, whether beyond visual range or close in a turning battle, the F-15 ruled the sky. It didn't just win, it owned the fight. For the first time, the Air Force had a true air superiority fighter, and they wanted to send a message loud enough for Moscow to hear. Only 18 months earlier, the Soviets had bragged about new climb records set by their MiG-25 Foxbat. But in 1975, the Eagle was about to settle that score once and for all. Engineers stripped a pre-production F-15 bare. No paint, no extra gear, nothing that wasn't mission-critical to make it as light as possible. Then they took it to the cold, dense air of North Dakota, fired up those twin engines, and lit the afterburners. From a dead stop, the Eagle shot skyward like a rocket, climbing through thin blue air all the way to the edge of space. 30 kilometers straight up, right to the edge of the Earth's stratosphere. Not only did it beat the MiG's record, it shattered it by more than 25%. That wasn't just a win. That was a statement. The Air Force finally had a fighter that didn't just meet expectations, it rewrote them. By 1974, The Eagle was already rolling off the production line. More than 400 early F-15 Amperes and B models were ordered for the US Air Force. And everyone who flew it knew the same thing. After years of playing defense, America was back on top of the sky. By the mid-70s, America's allies couldn't wait to get their hands on the new bird. Israel was the first in line in 1976, followed by Japan and then Saudi Arabia not long after. And with F-15 seconds now stationed in West Germany, staring straight across the Iron Curtain, it felt like only a matter of time before the Eagle and the Soviet MiG-25 Foxbat finally met in the wild. But when that day came, it didn't go down in flames. It came in the form of a defection. In September of 1976, a 29-year-old Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko made a decision that would rewrite everything the West thought it knew about the Foxbat. He took off from a base in the Soviet Far East and just kept flying. Across the Sea of Japan, low on fuel, alone, and very aware that if he was caught, he'd never see daylight again. Minutes later, his MiG-25 dropped onto a civilian runway in Hakodate, Japan, and just like that, the world's most secret fighter was sitting wide open for American engineers to pick apart. And what they found was shocking. Not because it was too advanced, but because it wasn't. From a distance, the Foxbat looked terrifying. All muscle, twin engines, wings like a glider. Up close, it was built like a tank that could fly. Mostly nickel-steel alloy, not lightweight titanium like analysts had guessed. The thing was massive, nearly twice the weight of the F-15. Those big, beautiful wings weren't for agility. They were just there to keep the beast in the air. In engineering terms, it was more brute force than finesse. Its engines were so hungry they burned through fuel like a drag racer, leaving the Foxbat with a combat range of barely 300 kilometers. And its maneuverability? Limited to about 4.5 Gs. That's nothing when you're up against an F-15 that can pull nearly double that without breaking a sweat. Even worse, when American techs cracked open the avionics, they didn't find any space-age circuits or secret Soviet magic. They found vacuum tubes. The same kind of tech you'd expect in a 1,950 seconds radio. Its radar couldn't even look down, meaning if an F-15 got below its nose, the Foxbat was basically blind. All that Cold War fear, all those headlines about a Soviet superfighter, turned out to be smoke and mirrors. The MiG-25 wasn't a dogfighter at all. It was an interceptor, plain and simple, designed to fly high and fast enough to chase down American bombers, not duel with fighters. In a way, it made sense. The Foxbat was like a sprinter built for a single burst, raw power, insane speed, but no endurance and no grace. The F-15, on the other hand, was an athlete, fast, flexible, and perfectly balanced. For the first time, the US realized the truth. The so-called Soviet superjet wasn't a threat to the Eagle. It was just a shadow, loud, fast, and overhyped. The truth was, the Foxbat was a one-trick pony. It could go fast, blisteringly fast, but it wasn't built to do much else. The Soviets had wrapped it in secrecy and sold the world a myth, cashing in on Western fear like a poker player bluffing with a weak hand. But now the bluff had been called. Because by 1976, Moscow didn't have a single fighter that could stand a chance in a real dogfight against the F-15. Not one. And the proof came fast. 3 years later, over the Middle East, Israeli pilots flying their brand new F-15 seconds shot down 4 Syrian MiG-21 seconds in a single engagement. The Eagle's very first combat test. And from that day on, the story was always the same. Battle after battle, year after year, the Eagle cleared the skies like it owned them. No rival, no mercy, no losses. To this day, F-15 seconds have scored more than 100 aerial victories without a single defeat. Not one. No other fighter in history even comes close. Early A and B models evolved into the C and D variants, each one stronger, faster, deadlier. And when engineers realized that this bird could carry more weight than most bombers, they turned it into a strike platform too, the F-15E Strike Eagle. Same DNA, different mission. It could drop bombs at supersonic speed, then turn anything foolish enough to chase it. Half a century later, the Eagle is still flying, and not as a museum piece. In 2021, the U.S. Air Force began taking delivery of the F-15X, a fully modernized beast built on the bones of the original legend. New cockpit, new radar, new digital systems, same old attitude. And that, to me, says something deeper. Technology ages fast. Legends don't. The F-15 is proof that great design, born from necessity, refined by fear, can outlast the very threats that created it. Meanwhile, the MiG-25 faded into history, a relic from a time when the Soviets were chasing speed instead of balance. It was never meant to duel with a fighter like the Eagle, but destiny had other plans. Because in January 1991, over the skies of Baghdad, the two Cold War icons finally met face to face. And the outcome? Well, it wasn't what anyone expected. The Foxbat still had one trick left: raw, unrelenting speed. It couldn't turn, but it could run like hell. And the Iraqis were about to use that to their advantage, hatching a daring plan to ambush the Eagles patrolling above their capital. That story, the last great duel of the Cold War, is one for another time. So, quick sidebar. If you're into stories like this one, Cold War dogfights, impossible engineering, or just crazy aviation history, you're gonna love Nebula. It's where creators like me can actually go deep without worrying about the algorithm cutting us off at the knees. You'll find tons of exclusive mustard videos over there, stuff that never even makes it to YouTube. We're talking the MiG-31 Interceptor, the F-117 Nighthawk, the Soviet M-50 Bounder, and, yeah, even the ridiculous MiG-25 business jet. Because apparently someone thought turning a Mach 3 Interceptor into a corporate aircraft was a good idea. And if you're into big, brainy projects, you'll find people like Real Life Law with his Modern Conflict series, Wendover Doing Jet Lag, and Neo's mind-bending visual documentaries, all in one place. What makes Nebula different is simple. No ads, no clickbait, and no algorithm deciding what's safe to post. Creators get to take risks, tell stories the way they should be told, and make passion projects that would never survive on normal platforms. And honestly, that freedom shows. When you take the handcuffs off creators, you get some of the best content on the internet, period. Oh, and if you've ever thought about becoming a creator yourself, Nebula's got you covered there too. They've got full Nebula classes, actual courses that teach you how to write, film, and build an audience from scratch. If you sign up using the link below, you'll get a $20 discount. That's just $2.50 a month. You get premium ad-free documentaries, support independent creators directly, and honestly, help projects like this one exist. So yeah, if you love stories about flight, engineering, and the wild, weird corners of history, Nebula's where you'll want to be.